his business to his own employees, who are now shareholders in it. Jeremy said rather mischievously, have you made some of your employees now liable for inheritance tax? Guy, and is this not quite the benevolent gesture that you hoped it would be, written on your tombstone? We'll tackle that in a minute.
Okay.
My name is Anita McNaught. I come and go from the ORFC. I am myself a farmer. I manage a small organic farm of only 85 acres, permanent pasture in Sussex, so I have skin in the game. This proposed change is, for me, absolutely hideous. All my plans for the future of sustaining my property are now in question. So this matters deeply to me. The liability I would have were I to be hit by a bus, were these tax changes to become law, would mean the end of my farming venture. So that's how seriously I take it. Jeremy, 2 months in, and you've had your ear to the ground and your ear in half the committee rooms in the country, I would imagine. Are there any signs that the government is listening to critics of this policy? Any signs at all that they might be rethinking?
Yeah, 2 levels in that. The first, with civil servants, yes, they're listening. We have continuing conversations with DEFRA, with Treasury officials, as well as with devolved governments who are also reacting very much to what the Treasury has said. So at that level, there's conversation. Is there any sign of policy changing? Not at the moment. In a sense, government will say no until it says yes. And I think that's a way to look at this. We've had previous exercises, for example, some may remember the omnishambles budget of George Osborne, the capacity tax. Well, that took a couple of months to be reversed. We're obviously now not looking at any early reversal, but we're coming in towards what is now called the spring statement rather than the budget on 26th March. That's a point where who knows what might be said in the wings of that around at least feathering the edges of the policy. We are playing this in real time. This is unknown territory. This is the first time, the first budget for this government. It was to define the government. It set a lot of store by it. It's got other positions that it would feel might be undermined if it gave something significant on this. But if people don't continue to make their points, then the issue falls. If people do continue to make their points, this is a political exercise. It is about democratic politics, and views will be put. Issues, you've mentioned Labour MPs, where they are with their constituents and the internal politics of where they are in Parliament, that's all an element of discussion and pressure, and this is how policy evolves. So everybody needs to continue to have their piece.
Talk through the process with me, should they decide not to amend the proposals in the budget. How soon could we start to see this getting set in stone, as opposed to being kicked around in select committees?
And I think that's important to understand, that we don't yet have the legislation. What we have is the usual, fairly detailed, fairly useful Treasury briefing paper, and of course some background discussions and so on around that. That's what you would get with any normal tax change, but it doesn't answer every question, and of course it's not, as we've just said, the end of the game. We're to get a consultation, not on the proposal, but on how it relates to trusts, which are a particularly complex area of the law. We're to get that consultation, they said, early in the new year, so perhaps fairly soon. They'd want it ahead of the spring statement. We don't expect to get the black and white legislation, the legislation on which people like me could actually come to people like you and start advising in hard terms. We don't get that published till perhaps July. So, and that's where we get to an interesting tension in terms of advice. If you're 95, probably you want to act now on what you know. And if you're 60, maybe you're happy and feeling healthy, you might want to wait until you actually see what the real rules are rather than what you think they might be. And then, so we expect that in the Finance Number 2 Act for 2025, and then to take effect at the moment again from April 2026.
I mean, we got used, particularly in the latter years of the Conservative government, with unpopular government proposals being reversed pretty fast. What are the sorts of signs you might see if they were thinking of going to reversal? You said we won't see from this government a change until they've decided it, but what might be an indication?
Well, I think there's really quite a substantial difference in looking at the two parliaments, where effectively the Tory backbenchers have just gone rogue. And it was open season at that point. Here you have got people go back to that vote on the fuel. No, it's the pension. No, it's the step before. It was the two bedroom benefit. Okay, so where 7 Labour MPs voted against, and they were just removed from the party. And that was a clear exercise of discipline very early on. They've gone through what almost looked like a public school initiation ritual over the fuel allowance, and making sure all the backbenchers' hands were dipped in blood at that point. But how long does this carry credit? How many? This is a small part of what happened with the budget. The 25 billion that they say they expect for employers' national insurance, as that comes through with where the retail sector, hospitality, the pubs, the caterers, the vegetable processors and so on all come through this spring. And all that's going to bear. This is quite a small part of all of this, but it's a very focused line of discussion that's coming from the sector.
Guy, you responded to the proposals in the budget fairly rapidly with an article in The Guardian, and you said there are issues that need to be addressed, and this might be a way to achieve some of it. You were particularly keen to see fairness in the sector. You were particularly outspoken against the use of agricultural land purchases by very wealthy people to evade their taxation responsibilities. Now you've had a chance to talk to other people. How has your view become nuanced, more nuanced?
Possibly. It's great to have such an unbiased chair, incidentally, actually. I do really at least respect that you declared your interest at the beginning.
Full disclosure always, Guy.
Having just chaired a session for the last time ever and found it impossible, I have some sympathy. Yeah, so my position really is, to rebuild our country, the country I love. We need some cash. We've got to raise some cash. It's got to come from somewhere. I feel very strongly it should come from those with most. And that doesn't just mean those that earn most, those that own most. And a farmer with £3 million is a very wealthy person. Probably in the top 5% of people in this country, Jeremy can probably contradict that or not, but probably the top 1% globally. So, and they do have options. Anita, you can sell some of your land. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit confrontational at the start, aren't I?
You're most welcome to be.
But they do have options compared to most people in the country who don't. I mean, I completely accept that their ability to earn reasonable returns on their wealth is ridiculously low, and there lies the problem, to my mind, not actually in the policy. Is that farming is just ridiculously unprofitable. But that's something that needs addressing. This is not the right tool to be doing it with. If we're going to make an exception of farmers, there needs to be a very good reason for it. Is the fact that they are impassioned in what they do enough? There are lots of other family businesses that may be impassioned about what they do, and then they don't get to pass their assets on free of inheritance tax. So I do have some issues. I have a lot of sympathy with the farmers, but I do have some issues with the calls for exceptionalism and the table thumping and as if they are the only people in this country who are suffering. We are going to have to get used to paying very substantially more tax, and I do feel that should come from the wealth. We've just been living for the last 14 years in a sort of fantasy that we can have anything like the public services that most of us want on the level of tax that we've been paying. There's going to have to be some big changes, and those are going to be very unpopular, and I would guess that this will be the first of many fights. But I mean, Jeremy, 400 million, is that the sort of sum?
Well, I mean, I was going to pick you up on one point in that.
Only one?
Well, no, I think nobody will. Which is that,
I haven't finished, incidentally.
That's right. No, but I think, but this has become very much an agricultural discussion. But it is actually about the 30% of the UK economy that is in privately owned businesses and family businesses. It's about the hauliers and the printers. It's about the garden centres. It's about the pubs and brewers. because the main part to look at this is the limitation on business property relief. That there then is an agricultural bell and whistle attached, and it's led to a lot of confusion because people love talking about agricultural property relief, but that's strictly only on the land and buildings and dwellings. Farmers, the main relief for farmers, ex the farmhouse, is business property relief that is there for all those other lines of business, and is the one that covers the machinery, the livestock, the silage, everything else, the operational bits of being a farmer are there under business property relief. It is that farming has been very swift to react in a very organised way and has the overlap with agricultural property relief that has driven this discussion. The other parts of private business haven't reacted to anything like the same extent, I think because they're probably more bothered by employers' national insurance tomorrow than the event of a death. Few of them die holding assets, and I think that's been a particular point, that it's been good tax advice for anybody in farming to die with the assets, whatever else has happened to management, for the last 32 years. And that's the shock now for people who are in their 90s, followed that advice, and have now seen it turned over. And there are transitional questions, perhaps, in that to play with. But this is actually the broader issue. And I think that's where it then comes, thinking about a cider maker's business I went to see back in the summer, and other situations in this, where when an individual who is retired dies, you can see that more or less as the closing of a book. The children live elsewhere. I mean, they may want to inherit the house, but it's the end of a chapter, if not the book. The presentation, particularly for farming, but it's true, I was on a platform just before Christmas, there was a brewing family there. They've been in business as brewers for 198 years. And it's passed on. All the family capital is tied up in that brewing business. If they're only going to pay the tax, they're going to have to take capital out of the business, and that's one, I think, we come back to this turning capital into public spending rather than, and I'll pick up on a point in that in a moment. If you're looking at this over a multi-generation perspective, then using the tax tail to drive disposal to produce the money to pay the tax is arguably the wrong way round. It's when there is a disposal and money is released that's when tax should be paid, because we want to have this consistent with good business planning, good investment, proper decisions about things like improving the land, the buildings to go in, the new technologies, the adaptation to climate change. And we're trying to run good businesses, not waiting for when the Grim Reaper calls suddenly to take 20% of the value out at a random date of his choosing. And I think that's the difficulty in this. And so this is where you mentioned Dan Needle, that's where he has now gone, which is to say, well, actually, hold on, let's accrue the reliefs, park them, and then they come in to pay when you have a disposal. And that's when it fits with the cycle of business decision-making and reorganisation as a factor and so on in that. But sorry, I wanted to make the point that actually all privately owned businesses, owned by families and individuals that aren't the big corporates, are in this frame.
They all have 10 years to pay. They all have 20% rather than 40% rates.
Yeah.
Including the 10 years to pay, that's nothing special for farmers.
No, I think I mean, you will have seen these figures as well as any of us have, which is that given the marginal profitability of many small to medium-sized farms, even a 10-year period to save up the money to pay for an inheritance tax liability will basically soak up the profit margin.
Get out of Jeremy whether that is particular to farmers or whether it's...
No, the 10-year to pay is allowed for relieved assets. So that is the APR and BPR assets.
Okay, I didn't realise that.
And that's allowed without interest. Other assets you can pay over the 10 years, but then you're at interest, which at the moment we're running at about 9% under tax legislation. But looking at it again, and I'm coming back to the farming basis, the kind of modelling I'm doing, looking at a number of perfectly typical farms, would come out at a rent equivalent, if I start that way, for a farming audience, a rent equivalent of £200, £350 an acre according to circumstances. Another way, and this is modelling I'm doing in Northern Ireland in this area, it's coming out according to the type of farm you're in, at between half and a full employee on the minimum wage. Effectively, half to a full-time person you're paying for doing no work. And it's that level of load on the farm as a business when you are looking, and this is, I think, one of the best examples of looking at this being back where we were in the late 70s, where taxation, public spending was crowding out private investment. Because
you could do the same sums on almost any business and refer it to almost any taxation. Yep. You're not putting forward an argument for exceptionalism for farmers.
Well, return on, I mean, this is where we come to the return on capital argument.
Which is, yes, carry on.
Yeah. The ratio between capital value and income is so different in farming from the other kinds of business that I was referring to.
And that's where I think this argument should be focused.
And that's where, and I've Mused and Farmers Guardian reported me on this last week, on their internet earlier this week, around whether then farming readjusts its relationship with its capital assets. Do you then look more at hire purchase rather than buying machinery? Do you look at having people contract rear heifers more if you're a dairy farmer? Do you look to rent more land from other people who are kind enough to be landlords of that land rather than own it? There are whole dynamic ripples flow over the next few years. And the Office for Budget Responsibility has said, while the Prime Minister said the figures are robust, they've said these are highly uncertain, these figures. It'll take 20 years for them to settle out to anything like stability. And I think there is a practical question about how you manage, if this is the policy, how you manage the transition from here to there in the kind of context we're talking about here.
Let's turn this another way. If this policy does go ahead, and as we probably all in this room agree, the wealthy should pay more tax. And there is an impact on farms from small, medium upwards. What do you think, Guy, the consequences of this tax coming to bear will be? Presumably we will see farms where a lot of land is suddenly sold. Do you have a feeling from what you've acquired land over the course of your professional life. Do you have a feeling for who will be in the market to buy it now? And is that going to be helpful to farming as a whole and regenerative farming?
Every bit of land I've bid on, I've always found myself up against someone desperate to get rid of, all the money they've made from selling land for development. That may be a function of living in South Devon, where there is, land prices and development prices are very high. And to my mind, that's where the government, I'm going to say 400 million as being, and a figure that they might raise from this. I think it depends on how behaviour changes. The most obvious change I would have thought is that those whose children are committed to farming will just gift the land to them. I know that sooner, and I know that brings in, they will raise the threshold that someone will, they might make someone liable for capital gains tax. Good. When that land is ever sold, yes, they should pay capital gains tax. I can't see that as an argument against it. So most people are just going to gift. Jeremy will know far more than that. I imagine the most obvious thing, people will take his advice and just gift the land sooner and therefore avoid this tax. And to have brought this in without closing that loophole, I don't know, just seems completely ridiculous. And to come back to the development land, the amount of money they could have gained by capturing some of that uplift in land prices, and who the hell would have defended the interests of a property developer? Really? That would not have been a particularly contentious thing. I'm guessing that the uplift in value in this country from land going to a development for housing or industrial or whatever would be somewhere between 10 and 30 billion a year. Just on some very crude sums. Even if they managed to raise, I'm trying to do my sums now. If they managed to raise, I think it's 1/25 of the lower one, it would still be more than they're going to raise from this. It's such a, why? They must be just kicking themselves for it's such a ridiculous policy. They must be. Why expend all that political capital for such an absolutely trivial amount of money? It's just, it's crazy, and I imagine they are. I don't know whether they will make a U-turn. There are probably lots of political reasons why it will be expensive for them to turn, but they must be kicking themselves. And why they couldn't have gone after, this, rollover relief, which is actually one of the things which has driven up land prices, is just the most ridiculous policy. Someone sells land, everyone around them has to suffer the consequences of the development, and they just take the land and go and buy 10 or even 100 times as much land with that money somewhere else, and therefore push up the prices. That's the money that they should have gone after.
And also setting the rate at 20%, not 40%, means that
Jeremy Clarkson should be paying 40% and shows to James Dyson, a working farmer, struggling to make a living, the threshold probably should have been much higher.
But aren't you worried, Guy, that when this land gets sold, because if this does become law, some family farms will be sold, that the people who will buy it will not be in the agricultural sector?
You have the option of selling 20% of the land and paying your capital gains. That is an option most people don't have. So this whole thing that farms are going to be sold because of this, if you own the land, that's just tosh. It's just emotive tosh. And I'm not going to stand for it, for this big argument being used again. James Rebank used it last night and again, in his speech. And I love most of what he says, but I'm afraid that's just emotive rubbish.
What I'm trying to pull you back to is the issue of whether the land stays as agricultural. Because the problem I think the farming sector will have is that there are many buyers for spare bits of agricultural land going in a tax-driven fire sale. And it won't stay in agriculture. And at a time when, would you not agree, issues of food sovereignty and food security have never been more important.
So who do you think is going to buy it? And what
I was going to ask both of you. I have a feeling locally to me in Sussex who the buyers of land are, and they aren't other farmers. No. Jeremy, you probably have bigger data on that.
Well, let's just play with this a bit. And I think assuming you are in a position where the easiest way to tackle this is to dispose of some land. And let's just say it's part of the farm. And you're going to have to dispose of a higher fraction than you need to pay the tax because you'll be paying capital gains tax on the disposal. And then you come back to the business consequences of the relationship between a farm with the same overheads and less productive capacity to carry those. And there's a business consequence. That will all be part of the decision making that business will be doing. And the answers will vary. So you offer it on the market. Now, and then individual farmers are probably now slightly or more disadvantaged in the marketplace because they are subject to the depredations of death and inheritance tax. One lot of buyers who are simply outside this game altogether are the people who don't die. So it's charities, it's the institutions, it's the corporations, and to some extent it's the larger institutional investment companies and so on. So at one end of the spectrum, but they're probably not in the main, some charities might be, but they're probably not in the main in the market for small blocks of land. So, but they are out there, particularly therefore for larger, more commercial land, or where they're looking for environmental purchases as environmental charities. They become like the monasteries of old in the sense they become bigger players in these markets. At the bottom end, so thinking of your 85 acres, and at which point you now sell 30 in order to be able to pay the tax on the 85 or whatever it is. At that point, the most obvious buyers in most cases are neighbours. Now, some of them will be farmers who will be bidding because there hasn't been land on the market around here since 1932. So, of course, they're bidding for it. Some of them, of course, will typically be, though, let's just call them the amenity buyers. For various purposes. Some people do like buying off-lying blocks of woodland for their own purposes. More often, you're looking at the fields around a nice house. They want to buy the chance to have it. It protects amenity. They may well then cheerfully let it back to somebody to farm. This is about not absolute changes, but biases in how these things might how the cookie might tend to crumble. And at which point, some of them will want it for their own purposes. They may want to choose to be less productive about it, have other environmental, personal goals with it. So you'll get a spectrum there between letting it back to the person who sold it, to farm as it was before, right the way through to it more or less falling out, if not moving into pony paddocks or whatever it might be. So I think there's a bias in this towards the land that comes on the market being less productive in farming terms at the end of this, but it's not an absolute thing. But land will tend to drift that way through the dynamics of that market because the farming buyers are looking over their shoulder at what they've got to have put by to meet the inheritance tax that they alone will be paying. If you're the neighbour buying land, well, probably you have the nice house, you're probably not buying it with a tax reason in mind. You're buying it because you're already high net worth. You're buying it because this is the chance to defend your position, own something tangible, all the various reasons why people like buying parts of England. And then and then at 20% relief if they're over £1 million, well, that's more than they would get on anything else. So far as tax comes into it. But again, it's too easy to view tax motivation in some of these things. They're buying because they got the money and it's nice and it's next door to them and they like it, and then it's their choices what they do with it. In your piece in The Guardian, you questioned whether the threshold was right, and that was a response that was common, actually, to both people who approved of the policy and disapproved of the policy. Do you feel that the threshold still needs to change?
Well, I think something needs
By
to be changed.
By threshold, I mean the £1 million, the £1 million cap.
Well, let's say 3 million. If it's in most instances, it's going to be a couple with the house. Whatever. Are you happy with that?
Well,
no.
Apparently, no.
No.
I mean,
okay.
As the numbers get increasingly crunched, it turns out that.
No. I mean, the 3 million the government's put in play because it's tried to give a well-meaning reassurance out there as to how actually it doesn't quite look like it is. But the 3 million is a misleading figure at best. Each taxpayer who is an owner in a business, and here we're talking about farming businesses, on their ownership will get £1 million. You get to 2 million because they've tried to look at a couple, but it could be a brother and a sister, it could be any family members. A critical point here, I think that has been misunderstood in some quarters, is the £1 million is not transferable between spouses. So it's not something that you can simply move on from husband to surviving widow or whatever it might be. The £1 million has to be used or it is lost at this point. But moving beyond that, the way they get to the 3 million, assuming you have a married couple or a civil partnership, because they're throwing in the nil rate bands. Now, I mean, to make the point slightly facetiously, that assumes you don't even own the bed that you die in if you're going to use it on the farm. You have to have normally the 325,000 will be used to some or full extent by whatever other assets the individual has. Now, it may be a little, it may be a lot, but effectively, if the 325 is only available for the farm, as I was saying earlier, you're a monk and then you're not married. They then throw in the 175,000 residential nil rate band amount. That is arguably more misleading because if you're on a farm and if you've got a farmhouse, then APR typically doesn't cover the full value of the farmhouse. It's a very important role of APR that actually is one of the few roles that APR really does fulfill, is it protects most of the value in most farmhouses. But you've got an extra bit that's market value above the agricultural value in the way it's assessed for tax purposes. That's where the 175,000 gets used. It's not usable for what would otherwise be covered by APR in that extent. And of course, a tenant can't give a tenanted farmhouse down anyway in these terms. So these are much more nuanced than the kind of bland reassurances ministers are giving in this territory. So it's best to focus on it's £1 million an owner. And if there's a bit of more bumps around the edges, then that's helpful. But to go the whole hog to 3 million is misleading.
You're aware, of course, Guy, when you talk about the gifting option, that if you give, you can't use from your gift. So a farmhouse in a farm given over to someone else with the 7 years to go.
You can rent it back from them just like anyone else could.
But what if the farm is your income and the farmhouse was your home? Where does the income come for a farmer?
Well, I'm going to assume that most people planning the inheritance of their children and trust their children to run the business in a way that, I mean, if they don't, why on earth are they concerned about whether they've been paying tax on it or not? So I think let's assume they do trust them. And actually to gift it and then rent it back off them, it strikes me as a very tax-efficient way of actually passing more money on to your forebears if that's what you want to do. It seems pretty doable to me.
Yeah, the challenge is how much money there is loose in this. If you're looking at a farm worth, or any business worth 20 million, there's a lot more flexibility to play with in the components for this. If you're looking at a farm like yours, There's relatively limited flexibility in terms of income, in terms of accommodation. And I think this comes back to the thresholds argument, if you're looking at this as a policy. These things always bite hardest on the small and the edging into the medium. The larger estates have got more flexibility in how they play with it. And so, yes, if you're going to pay a market rent, well, what's the market rent on your farmhouse? 20, I mean, I don't know your house, but I'm guessing a nice farm in Sussex, 25,000, yes.
Yeah.
That's to be found out of your post-tax income. Where is that income coming from? And this is where I come back again thinking about that million, not transferable between spouses. And I think they're an advised spouse thinking about the surviving spouse has an interesting and difficult challenge. Do they maximise the million by giving it down a generation? Or do they protect the income and accommodation of the surviving spouse? And people who haven't thought about that may be regretted by all the survivors in different directions. And people who have thought about it may find that they don't use the full million if they care enough about the surviving spouse in order to protect resources. So, this is where the answers are going to be very individual in different cases, and especially in this first few transitional years, when people who have lived for a generation with one set of planning tax advice are now having to adapt to a different situation.
Guy, do you feel that we're going to get a better farming sector out of these proposed tax changes? We'll open to the floor shortly.
No, I don't really. I mean, if I look at my neighbour, he probably has 300 acres and a farmhouse, so, that's probably 4 or 5 million in our part of the world, even though it's, not great land, and he really wants to pass it on to his daughter. He works bloody hard. I don't think he makes a huge amount of money. He's a good farmer. I would love to see him be able to pass it on to his daughter. This is going to clearly make it more difficult. But, I mean, raising tax from anyone is not easy. I mean, no one relishes paying it. So, is it going to make farming better? No. I mean, taking 400 million out of farming is not going to make it better. I mean, it is possible, and I heard Jeremy argue very convincingly that this wouldn't lead to a drop in land prices. I mean, personally, I would love to see land prices come down. I'm about to sell my farm in France for less than 1/10 of the value of land here.
I wanted to talk to you about that.
Because they have different sort of legislation that makes farmland very unattractive to speculators, and as a result, it's much, much cheaper, and it's much, much possible. I'm selling it to two of the staff on the farm who could probably raise 30,000 between them. Yet they're going to buy a 300-acre farm with a 1.2 million turnover that's quite profitable, and they're able to do that in France because land is a lot cheaper and they have a much more sympathetic banking system. So I do think there's a lot to be said for their system. I'm losing myself a bit. What was the question? Have I answered it?
It's a very broad question. It was, will we see a better farming sector, a better agricultural sector as a result of these changes? And you were thinking perhaps one of the results might be that land prices came down. No one seems to think that will happen.
Jeremy knows a lot more about this. He's a professional valuer. I'm going to, if he says they won't, then I'll believe him.
The guess at the moment is that, to take the UK as a whole, land values don't move because of this. Now, there may be particular areas, and I was talking with somebody in a peninsula in Scotland, where the only buyers in that area are likely to be farmers just like him. So if land comes on the market, if that market is starved of liquidity through this, then that may be an area where something does move. But take the UK as a whole, certainly talking with the banks, they appear serene about all of this. Now, they were the first people I talked to thinking, banking interest and security for loans, where are they going to be? And they appear serene.
Why?
Because they see the liquidity staying in the market to do the buying. I think your question is an interesting one, because there is, Guy's being provocative from one direction. There is there is the Darwinian argument. This is the cold bath argument, that you strip subsidy out of England in the way that's been accelerated by the removal of money from delinking. You're piling on significant financial shocks, more than, if you like, the phased transition that we'd had up to this year. All of a sudden, that's been accelerated massively by the removal of almost all delinking, and I'm assuming it goes in 26, what's left. And you're looking now to precipitate the creative destruction of existing businesses, so they release assets that move on, and you start playing with the argument: does this mean that land moves in the directions of the more proficient people who will use it better, and so forth? Everything that would happen more slowly through the current stimuli. And the trouble is, you play with, this is an argument after the third pint, and actually, as you test it, it's very difficult to see the world materialising in that kind of Darwinian free market way to deliver a better answer. The appetites people have for buying land are different to those that motivate pure farming. And so does this lot actually deliver a better farming sector? And the other challenge to that is, I go back to my argument about it being better to raise tax when the money is naturally available to pay it. I want good businesses. I want them to plan ahead for the future. I was playing, I'm going back to a tented farm I went 2 years ago. He had developed a wedding venue business. And he'd started at, say he was age 40. And he'd done it in the sort of jury-rigged way that you start a thing on a farm, and then at 50 he realised it was going quite well. So he sunk a lot of money into getting it going. Then in his later 60s, it's all very tired. And he is sinking, the question now is, do I sink a lot of money in it for the next 15 years at 67? Or do I pull? And in this context, that becomes a harder decision than it would be if you were not having money, this challenge to when money might be taken out of the business. And the need we have for reinvestment in farming, the need we have to adapt to climate change, the need we have to move into the new technologies, all the various other challenges that are around. I would like a tax system that is framed around delivering good businesses that then pay more tax, rather than taking capital now just to turn it into current spending.
And your advice might be now that, given the potential threat to taxation on business assets, that a programme of de-diversification
we're upping the risk for no more reward. And I think and that comes back again to your question: does this, when we need to confront and take on more risk to handle a more risky world, to encourage people to hunker down in ways that protect themselves, it seems less attractive.
I'm just checking. Thank you. I was just looking for a time check there. What about the other? I mean, a cynic might also say, a cynic, not me, Guy, might also say perhaps this government isn't the most pro-farming government we've had in a while. Perhaps they don't particularly understand the nuts and bolts of farming, but maybe they are aware that they're not meeting their net zero targets. And maybe implementing a policy that scoops up a bit of tax revenue and knocks a few farms off the list of farms producing methane and other things that...
I think you're just, to my mind... a
cynic might say.
DEFRA knew nothing about this 24 hours before it was announced publicly. Any idea that this is a carefully thought-through policy, I think, is pretty self-evidently wrong. And I do have a bit of a suspicion that the regressive, not sure that's the right word, elements in the Labour Party anyway that probably would love to kick farmers, that there was a little bit of this, finding voice in this policy. And I bet they're kicking themselves now, because it was clearly a very badly implemented, badly communicated policy.
I think your cynic, whichever way you're looking at, is overthinking this one seriously.
Yeah, I really don't.
The way I'm inclined to look at this, there was a bit of discussion 18 months ago in Labour about looking at APR and BPR, because they love to itch about these things, and they knew they had a difficult public spending position. They wanted to talk about focusing the reliefs on where they were most needed. And that's one part of the discussion. What you also have, because ministers and so on tend not to know too much about what they're dealing with, so they go to the civil servants and say, these are the areas we're interested in. And the civil servants come up with a range of options. Now, capping APR has been in Treasury papers for well over a decade. It's just that previous ministers have chosen not to pick it up. And I think there's a bit of a risk that Rachel Reeves has, on the whole, bought the entire package of duff options that all previous ministers have not taken up, and is now saddled with them. And we have to work it through. And I think it's almost as basic as that. They didn't ask the right questions. They didn't pursue the data properly. They didn't know who it would affect. They're stuck on the figures that they've now hanged themselves on, which don't pick up all the farmers who make their inheritance tax relief claims under business property relief only. And so my calculation is they've understated the impact by fivefold.
What proportion of farmers do you think in the UK will be affected by this? Quick answer, because we need to wrap. Wrap phase one.
Right, I'm not going to give you a proportion, but my figures come out at over a generation, 75,000 farming taxpayers. Mm-hmm. That's arguably a quarter of the pool of people who are involved in farm businesses. But they're the people who are the guts of farming.
And this, of course, will continue. This isn't a one-off. This will continue every time someone farming dies.
Sorry, this has to be seen over a generation. The government's figure this affects 500 people in 26-27 assumes it doesn't matter if you die in May 27.
I mean, the reason we're talking about this and why we're arguing for an exception from farming is because farming is so very, very unpopular, unprofitable. The reason it is so unprofitable is farmers don't get a fair price because they get screwed by the supermarkets. That's what we should be talking about. Yes. If they made anything like the same returns on capital that other people do, this would just not be an issue. We would not be talking about it. So it frustrates me that there are all these protests, against this, when what farmers should be protesting about is getting screwed by supermarkets. And that's what we should be calling for government action on, rather than pleading on bended knee to be treated as an exception. And my worry in that this, the political capital that we have, and farmers have a huge amount of political capital. I just can't understand why they have so much, but they do. And the danger is that because they behave so badly, some of them, I'm sorry, but they do, and have brought huge consequences on the rest of the nation. And that if we lose that capital, the political drive to make sure that we are treated more fairly by our fair customers will lose that as well. So I think some of the ethnic cleansing of the countryside language that has been used, which I can't understand how they've got away with that, is very provocative, and I think risks really backfiring on farmers, and I think we need to be very careful about that.
Right. We're going to end session one and immediately segue into session two. We have to vacate this room to allow the next session to happen. But knowing that we need questions from the floor, knowing also that we want to delve into the nuts and bolts of this proposed policy and how a farmer with a small to medium-sized farm might get around it, we're going to if it indeed it's at all possible, we're going to adjourn to the side room, round the other side of the building there, and carry on. So all of you who are still interested in this issue, want to hear more from Jeremy and Guy, are welcome to join us, and it'll be a much more participatory session than it has been up till now. I just wanted to get the most from our two very talented and articulate panellists, who I thank for this, but do please join us next door.
Very unbiased chair.